Hi there, this is Philip from Beyond the Tabletop. In this video we finish up with the instructions, adding in the rear gunner and sponson weapons, along with adding in some of the extra details. We're now on the final page of instructions. Now the next step is to build these Twin Heavy Stubber guns which go on the rear section of a Gorgon. As I've shown previously, I've already painted up my gunners already, so they're good to go. However, we're going to build these guns and keep them separate from the gunner and the Gorgon, so we can paint them up separately and then glue everything together at the very end. Then there's some smaller details to add in, such as the spotlight rail, the spotlights and the ladder, along with the fuel drums. And then lastly, there's the two sponson options, either the Gorgon mortars or the heavy weapon options, which is either the bolter, the stubber or the flamer. I'm going to magnetise mine to do both. The dual heavy weapon set is the one I have, so this is the one I'll be covering in the walkthrough. So let's get on with the next step. There's three parts that you'll need. There's the heavy stubber gun itself, the mount and the ammo belt that joins the two together. Later on you'll need the gunner and the arms, but we can worry about that once everything's been painted up. So I've already clipped off the components from the sprue. I've got the Twin Heavy Stubber, the gun mount and the two ammo feeds. Two ammo feeds came from this block here. The block that had the ammo feeds on also has two extra ammo boxes along with the gun handle. Now the gun handle will attach to the back of the gun just here, but you only need to do that if you're not using the two gunners, because the gunner arm is already holding that piece, so that's just a spare. These two ammo boxes here are completely spare, as the gun mount already has them modelled on, so I'm not too sure why we've got these. I guess they could be used as extra decorative elements. You could have them scattered around on the floor just next to the gun, otherwise you can put them in your bits box. When it comes to adding the heavy stubber to the gun mount, you need to make sure that the gun is the right way round. You can tell that from two ways. One, that there's more detail at the top than there is on the underside, but also there's a slight cut-in just below the hole pointing downwards. And then when it comes to this gun mount, you obviously want it facing forwards because you don't want it back to front. An easy way to tell is that these two bumps face forwards. So when it comes to mounting the gun, you need to know that this is the right way up and then this is facing forwards, and then it just clips in place relatively easily. Currently the gun can swivel up and down, however once you add in the ammo feed, that will lock it in place in a vertical position. When it comes to adding in the ammo feed, you've got this little top notch which just goes in this hole here, and then the bottom part of the ammo feed just goes in that area there, so it looks like it's coming out of the box. It would probably be easiest to glue in the top section first, and then you can line it up with the bottom feed, which will look like this. And then you can flip it around and do the other side. If you ever so lightly depress the back half of the gun downwards, that will actually help hold the ammo feed in place. So then you can add in the next one. Then you can very carefully have them both in place. Now the thing here is just to check that the gun is as vertical as it can possibly be, just so it can line up with the gunner later on when you add him in. I've got the two Twin Heavy Stubber guns now all glued together. The other thing that I forgot to mention is just to make sure that the ammo feeds are facing the right way round. You need the tips of the bullets facing forwards. While it seems like an obvious thing to mention, it's quite a small detail that could easily be overlooked. If I just bring in the Gorgon, we can do a test fit. You can see that there's a little notch and a hole in the very bottom of the gun mount, so they should fit in together quite nicely and just slot in like so. And then I can do that on the other side as well, and there we have the two guns. And if I just zoom out for a second, you can see how they look mounted on the Gorgon. We can ignore adding in the gunner because that's already painted and going to be added separately. And then the next step is just to add on the gun shield to the gun. This is something I'm probably going to again keep separately and add on once it's all painted up. Here is the gun shield piece that we next need to add on. These two sections here are what will mount it to the gun, and I believe it just needs mounting here. So the gun shield should fit on just at that point. You could of course glue it on now and paint all of that up as one section. However, with the shield glued in place, it's going to be tricky to paint up some of the parts, such as the ammo feed. So I'm going to keep this as a sub-assembly. I'm going to paint up the shield and the gun separate, and then once they're painted I can glue the two pieces together. However, we can do a quick test fit just to make sure that that's in the right place and add it to the Gorgon. It should just be a matter of sliding it in and making sure those two notches between the gun mount and the Gorgon join together. Once that gun is mounted in theory it should be able to pivot side to side. Originally I was thinking about gluing that down into place. Now I had two concerns about that. One of them is that if this gun ever gets knocked, then that's going to snap quite easily. Now the other thing, it'd be quite good to be able to remove this from time to time, partly just so I can give that area a dust, or if I need to do anything into the cab, having this fixed in place will be really difficult. Also, if the gun and the gunner ever get chipped or I need to do any touch-up jobs on the paint, it'll be a lot easier to be able to take that out. So with that in mind, I've decided to magnetise the guns in place. Now if we flip it around to this gun, you can see that this one is magnetised in and it just lifts out really easily. I've used a set of 3mm magnets. So to get that in place, what I did is I used a 1mm drill to do a pilot hole just down into that notch. With that hole made in place, I could use a knife and carefully remove that notch. Then I could swap it out for a 3mm drill and do a hole that's 3mm deep, because what I want is a slight bump up, which helps lock those two magnets in place. You could just have your two magnets flush, but I think having the notch up, a bit like on this one, will help secure the gun in place. With the magnet dry, it's just a matter of placing it in to test that it fits okay. And there we have it. So it can snap in relatively easily. In theory, it can currently pivot around and then it can easily come off. Again, if you were to knock this, it's not going to damage. The next step is to add the spotlight and the spotlight rail. However, because this covers the gun compartment, I can't glue it in place just yet, because it means I then won't be able to add in the gun or the gunner once everything is painted. I can still assemble the spotlight and the spotlight rail together, so I'm only painting them as one piece rather than two separate pieces. I've got the spotlight rail just here. This is the right hand side one, and then I've got the spotlight itself, and you can see how these two will just clip into place and they go in like that. So really easy to put these two bits together. And then you just need to do the same on the left hand side. However, this one won't clip in place as smoothly, so this one's only going to be secure once I've glued it in place. I've now got both of the spotlight rails glued together. The main thing in terms of positioning for that spotlight is just to try and get it equally balanced between the rivets on this side where the curve is and these rivets just at the very end. So they're kind of equidistant between the two, and that should give you a really good position for them hanging off the side. The next thing to do is bring back in the Gorgon and do a dry fit of these pieces to make sure they fit okay. So doing a close-up, you can see how this should lock in to the top of the Gorgon driver compartment, and then this section needs to clip in. However, this bit here is at slightly the wrong angle, so I'm going to have to just force this in and that will clip it in place. However, this bit is now under tension, which is what I don't want, because if I let go it will just snap off. So while I could just glue it in, I'm sure it would be fine, but I'd be much better off heating this piece up ever so slightly so it can naturally bend into that shape, and then there won't be any stress. The alternative is to heat up this piece, but that will give you a bit of an unnatural bend, whereas at the moment it's quite flat. I've also got the same issue on the other side, so if I just show you what this side looks like. So again, clipping in that notch first is probably the best way to do it, and then I can bend it in and you can see it in place like so. So I'll just need to go away and use my heat gun and heat these bits up ever so slightly just to bend them into position. So I've gone away and I've just heated up these two side pieces, and you can see that these two rails now just happily sit in place because they're now no longer under tension. So you can see I can now easily take them off and put them back on again, and there's no tension or movement in this section here. That will be much better for the model in the long run. So we can put the rails to one side because we'll paint them up separately, and we can move on to the next step, which is adding in the ladder. I've now managed to add the ladder in. If I give you a close-up, you can see how it looks. It goes to the notches. Currently I've not glued it in, so I can just pull it out and also put it back in again. If you actually look at the side, you can see there's actually a gap between it, so the only place that it's actually secure to is these 2 points up here, which is a little worrying. If we just look underneath, I've just drilled out those holes a little bit more. The hole is around about 1.8 millimeters, and just by drilling it out means I can recess it down about that much rather than that much. So that will just help secure it in place. So there's two reasons why I'm going to paint the ladder up separately. One is so I can easily paint the areas behind the ladder. So secondly, if you look at the ladder in comparison to the rest of the model, it dips down below this piece. Now I'm going to be painting these two track pieces separately. So for most of the time the kit is going to be like this, and placing it down on here, I can do it gently. Now while I'm painting the kit it's going to be like this, and that's going to put a lot of undue stress on the ladder, which I really don't want to do. So for now it will be just best to take that off and paint it separately. So I'm going to put that with my other individual bits to paint up, such as the light rail and the heavy stubber guns. Next step is to add on the fuel drums. There's 4 in total and they're attached as 2 separate sets either side of the ramp. You can see I've just got them here. Up close it's easy to tell which way around they need to be attached because these straps will hang downwards, and they attach to the Gorgon by these 2 points here. You can just see that it needs to attach on like so, and then another one needs to stack just below. Looking at the left hand side one, the barrel attaches right up to the ladder, which is good because you do need some additional support for that ladder. Again, it'll be worth painting up those barrels separately so I can easily paint the Gorgon up first. What it'd be worth doing, however, is gluing the 2 barrels together just so they are connected, and it'll be easier to paint those 2 up as one whole piece rather than 2 separate pieces. So if I roll each barrel around so the flat part is on the floor, and then I'll do that on the other side as well, so that contact point that joins the Gorgon is on the floor, and then I can just butt these 2 parts up together, and that will show me which bits need gluing, which is basically the straps and the edge of the barrel, because they are the contact points. So what I can do is just add some glue here and then attach the 2 bits together, and then that will give me one piece that I can easily paint up rather than 2. So both sets of barrels are now glued together, so I can easily pick them up. I'm still going to be quite delicate with them because the contact point is quite fine, and it will only be once they're glued onto the Gorgon finally when they're a bit more secure. I can now do a test fit on both barrels just to make sure they fit in okay. So you can see that they mount quite flush, and with the set on the left hand side you can see that they will just fit in there and it should mount up quite nicely against that ladder, again securing that ladder in place a lot better. So the barrels can go with the ladder and the guns and be painted up separately. We're now at the last set of assembly instructions, which is the side sponsons. So there is part A, which is the Gorgon mortars, which I don't have unfortunately, so I can't walk you through that section, but I do have the heavy weapon options, which is either the dual heavy bolter, heavy stubber or heavy flamers. Here are the sponsons. I've already completed one set on the left hand side. The other set is half built, purely because I wanted to show you how some of it looks on the sprue and how I've converted up the pieces. Here's the completed sponson unit, and you can see that the sponsons move side to side, but I've also magnetised these pieces so I can easily swap them out. I've just used a 2mm magnet for both halves. So I've also got the heavy bolter. For the heavy bolter I've also drilled out the barrel holes just to complete that look. And then lastly you've got the heavy stubber. The heavy stubber oddly has a right way up. You can see these 2 little notches, they point upwards just so you can make sure you don't get it upside down. And there we go. Let me run you through how they all look. So here's the set with the heavy stubbers. Here we have the heavy bolters. And then lastly we've got those heavy flamers. So the idea is that once this whole sponson unit is glued onto the Gorgon, I can still quite easily swap out the weapon options each time I want to play the game. Here's the other sponson. You can see there's a few places where I've had to use some green stuff just because there was a fair bit of mould slippage, so I just had to re-sand that down, and in doing so I lost a couple of rivets and I've had to recreate them from plasticard. Now to recreate the rivets I've just used a small piece of styrene rod and with a knife carefully cut out a thin disc that I could then glue in place. Here I've got them from evergreen scale models and I've just got a 0.5mm rod. The fact that it's on the bottom makes it less noticeable, and the ones on the top are all perfectly fine. Let's look at the weapons themselves. You can see they come on this sprue all together. There's a tiny plug which allows you to fit the sponson into the hole. Now that to me doesn't seem very strong. It would be fine if you were just gluing them in place, but I want the flexibility of trying out all these different weapon options, so that's why I've magnetised it. So to magnetise it, it was quite straightforward. It was just a matter of drilling out that hole with a 2mm drill bit and adding in the magnet. For the weapons themselves, I just had to cut off those notches and then carefully drill down. Be especially careful with the heavy stubber, because that is actually a really small piece that you're drilling into. If I show you one that I've already done, you can see that there's not a whole lot of room to play with, especially when you think about the depth of the magnet is about 1mm. So you just need to be careful not to drill out too much, because you'll start damaging this section just here. With that done, it's just a matter of assembling your sponson. You just need to flip it around, mount the sponson through those two grooves, and then flip it back round. You won't want to glue that in place so they can freely move around, and then take a weapon of your choice and just attach it. And that will now be in place. The sponsons themselves can still drop out quite easily, so you'll just need to have to hold the sponson in place until you're ready to glue the whole piece to the sponson. With the weapon options all magnetised, it's now time to look at how you mount the sponson onto the tracks. I've laid them out already so you can see the position that they need to go in. There's an easy guide for you, however. So you've got these two brackets going down, and then on the underside of your sponson you've got 3 brackets. That's because it's the same piece for the left and the right, so you just need to use 2, and that those grooves should line up with the brackets. So you can place that down. You can wiggle it about a little bit, but it should pretty much lock into place. As you can see up close, even with the sponsons dead in the middle, you're ever so slightly overlapping this top bracket and this bottom bracket. That just seems to be how it's been designed. It seems a little bit odd to me and slightly wrong, but that's just how it is. There'll be a tiny gap either side once that's glued in, and you can just green stuff that to seal it up. Obviously make sure you've got your sponsons in place before you do that though, otherwise you won't be able to get them in. Looking at the back where these grooves are, you might just need to cut out this little section just here, just to allow the bracket to fit in slightly better. And obviously do a test fit before you glue everything in. It's a similar situation for the other side. You've got a slight overlap of those 2 brackets. The rivets are ever so slightly misaligned, and then you've got a tiny gap at the front and the back. And you can also see how the bracket lines up with the groove. Now before I glue this in place, I think it's best to look at the possible options if you did want to swap it out with the Gorgon mortars. As I don't have it, I'm just going to have to speculate based on the pictures provided. If we look at this picture here, you can see that the best place to magnetise it would be in this block here, because that would be the largest section, and that appears in the second half of this top bracket going along. If we then compare that with this top bracket, the second half only really goes up to about here, so this spot just here would probably be the ideal place to add in a magnet. Now if you had a large enough magnet that was say 6 or maybe 8mm wide, that might be strong enough to hold both pieces in place, but I can't guarantee it as I can't test it out. Another solution might be to pin them in place, in which case you could get away with much smaller holes. For example, this small area here might be good enough to have a pin mounted, and then you could have one down here, which would mean you could have a pin just here and up here, and that would allow you to slot this on and lock this in place. Now when you're trying to align something for pinning or magnetising, it's actually really difficult to do, especially when it needs to be millimetre precise. So if you are going to do that, you need to be very careful about what you're doing, and you have to make sure that you do that for not just this sponson and the other side, but also for your 2 other sponsons. But that will give you the flexibility in being able to swap them over. Unfortunately, as I don't have these mortars, I'm going to just have to glue this in place. The sponsons are now glued on, and I've just green stuffed the edges, just mostly along the sides and that little top section there. And there's not been too much on the bottom. I was quite careful when I glued it in the sponson not to glue in the gun part, so they're still free to rotate around. I can show you the right hand side one as well, where I've green stuffed the sides, and on this one I sort of had to green stuff along the top a little bit more. Now this one looks a lot messier, and that's just because there's a lot of black on there, and that's actually just come from my silicone brush. So I've been using a silicone brush, which is really handy just for pushing in the green stuff, just getting it into all those recesses and moving it along so I'm not obscuring any of the details of the rivets. And I've also been doing that here, but as I've been brushing it along, the rivets have been catching it and just pulling a small bit of the silicone off, which is why there's a lot of black. Once the green stuff has set, I'll probably just go in with a regular brush just to dust it off and try and remove some of that black stuff. However, once it's all painted, it won't be noticeable. So the sponsons were the last part of the instructions, and if you've been gluing everything together, you should now have a completed model. Mine obviously isn't completed, and that's just because I'm doing a sub-assembly, so it makes it a lot easier to paint the inside and some of the other areas. What we can do next is a dry fit of all the parts just to see how the completed model will look. What we can do is follow the instruction guide and follow the exact same order of putting it together. So we've got the main hull, and then we want to add on the sides so they can clip together through those slots. Then we want to add in the main ram. Then we can add in the hull braces, and again making sure that the ones marked for the front go in the front, and add in the back one. Again, making sure that they're the right way around because they have a custom fit. Now if I flip it round to the back, we can concentrate on the area at the back. So if I take the gun mount and gun shield and just fit those two together, and then I can carefully add this to the back of the Gorgon, and it should just snap into place due to those magnets, and I can just do the same with the other one. Then we've got the searchlight rails which can just fit on the top. Then we've got the ladder. Now for the barrels, they won't stick on as they are, so I've just added a small bit of blue tack to the back, which will help me add them in. And this should give you a rough look of how all the rear detail is going to fit together before it's glued in place. And then I can spin it around to the sides, and we can add in the weapon options for the sponsons. For this one, let's go for the classic heavy bolter look, and they just easily plug in due to the magnets. So there we have it, the completed Gorgon. All parts still move around in terms of the sponsons. The inner ramp also drops down along with the outer ramp, and also these two guns will spin around on their magnetised pivot. And then at the very back you've got the rear door, which will also come down, but that's still sealed because that area has all been painted. We've completed the instructions, so the Gorgon should now all be ready to paint. However, I'll be doing one final build video where I talk about adding in some extra detail. I'll be adding in some radio antennae, some spent ammo for the Twin Heavy Stubbers, along with adding in the Gorgon infantry set that complements this kit. As always, I hope you've enjoyed that video. Feel free to drop me a comment below, and if you want to stay notified about the next video, make sure you're subscribed. Until the next time, take care.